Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lesson, how you go about articulating gestures. So last week we looked at how to produce a gesture drawing from a figure reference or from life, and that was following on from the previous week's lesson which was about basic line drawing. So we basically created a gesture like this one on the right, from, in this case, a photographic reference, but this sort of gesture could be made from a figure in real life as well. So we looked at simple sort of curves and straight lines 2 weeks ago. Then last week we looked at producing a figure gesture using those straight lines, some of the general principles when you make a figure. And finally today, as a kind of end point of our just basic line drawing, we're going to be looking at how you can articulate that gesture. Articulation, as far as I refer to it, is basically adding constructive lines, kind of detailed lines to the outside contour of your drawing. So as this stands, it's mostly just sort of simplified outside contour, but obviously in the original reference there's a lot more detail. So we're going to be looking at how you can go about making sure your lines remain accurate as you start to add them, and we're also going to be looking at what you should be thinking about when you're making these lines, so we can get started. Now, the first thing I want you to think about when you're articulating a gesture like this, so adding detail to a gesture like this, is something which you can actually do in the earlier stages but we haven't quite covered yet, and that's using horizontal and vertical alignments. So it's pretty simple when you're using horizontal and vertical alignments from a photograph, but you can do the same from life. It's a little bit more complicated, but you can do the same thing. Basically, a horizontal alignment is when, if I was to lay my, in this case it's a knitting needle, but a straight implement across the paper, or you can use your eye, but it's a bit more clear with the paper. If I kind of slide the ruler up, or the knitting needle up and down the image, you'll see that at certain points certain portions line up with one another. So we could say the top of the knee roughly matches this indent in the back. So if I was making my drawing and I noticed that those didn't line up, I'd know that something was off in my drawing compared to reality. Equally, we could say this high point of the shoulder roughly matches about the top of the thumb that's resting on his face. And that's pretty much it for horizontal alignments. The same goes for vertical alignments. So we could say this point where the foot overlaps the box aligns with just about the back of his head, so not quite the point at which the neck turns into the back of the head, but just about it lines up. Last week I think I spoke a little bit about you'll tend to find that the head sits above the centre of gravity. In this case it's a seated figure, so the centre's a bit more complex, but when you're looking at vertical alignments, you'll tend to find in a standing figure the most obvious vertical alignment will be the kind of centre of the head's weight will sit over the centre of the whole figure's weight. Another one for this figure vertically could be this corner of the box roughly matches that point there, which also matched with this thumb. So if you start thinking about it that way, if you ever come across issues in your drawing as you're working with your eye and you want to kind of double check them, you can kind of look at horizontal alignments with your eye, so long as you're just kind of looking across the image and the reference reasonably vertically, you'll see things slightly off. If you want to be more accurate, it's better to use an implement. If you're working in real life, you basically would hold, with two hands you'd hold a ruler or a knitting needle, something thin, or a pencil or a paintbrush, as level as possible to look for those alignments, something like this. If you were working for vertical, you have to be careful that whatever you're holding hangs straight down. So with the knitting needle, it's got this little weight on the end of it. If I hold it really lightly at the top and it swings around, it'll tend to just fall, because of gravity, fall as straight as possible. The other thing you can use for that is a plumb weight. But basically, if you were to hold that kind of in front of your eye, between you and the model, whatever you're working from, and then do the same on your drawing, you'll notice that vertical alignments might be off. So it is possible to use these in real life as well as when you're working from a photograph. Now, the other thing I want you to think about alongside alignments are angles. So this image is obviously made up of lots of different angles, changes of direction essentially, and that's what we're really looking for when we're articulating. So this back is simplified into just a big general curve, but there's lots of points where there are little cutbacks because different muscles are there or different bones are jutting out. And what we're looking for are where they occur in terms of distance and what angle occurs at that point of change of direction. So the articulated version of this drawing will become use a lot more straight lines, fewer curves. That's because we're trying to figure out the exact construction of the figure. We use the curves to create our gesture, so to kind of look at all the nice flowing curves, say C curves that relate to each other. That's the sort of compositional aspect. As we move into the articulation of the drawing, it becomes a bit more constructive, so we're looking at how the figure is actually constructed and trying to give it a sense of realistic anatomy if possible. We can also emphasize particular muscle groups that are prominent, that are important to the drawing. But that's something we'll get into a little bit later with more advanced figure drawing. But for now we're just looking at how you can go about adding detail to a contour. But talking about angles, I mean a pretty clear angle in this is actually the box. So this box juts back here, it's two straight lines, and you want to kind of think about, you don't actually have to measure the angle and figure out how many degrees it is, but between your drawing and the reference, you want to see what that angle is. If I flick my eyes back and forwards between the 2 points, I can see if it feels like my angle. I would say this angle feels like it's too shallow, so it's too obtuse and needs to be more acute, which would mean trying to pick up probably this line. I think needs to move upward a little bit more. I mean, it might just be a case of me being slightly off when I first placed it, so it might need to be something more like that, which now works better as I flick my eye backwards and forwards. When I say flick your eye, I mean move your eye pretty quickly backwards and forwards between the image and your reference. And what that sort of does is it almost animates what you're looking at. So if you imagine animation, are lots of frames that flow one another or after one another, give the sense of movement. You'll notice that as you flick your eye backwards and forwards between your image and the reference, even in real life, you'll start to see discrepancies, a bit like a spot the difference. A lot of observational drawing is basically like spot the difference. So you have your reference, which is what you're working from, and your drawing is what you're producing, and you want to see what is it that's different in your drawing from the figure, how are you deviating from your reference. But yeah, that's pretty much it for angles. We'll be getting into it a bit more when I actually demonstrate how you go about doing it. It's something that's pretty kind of pervasive as you're working, so I'll try to make mention of it as much as possible. Another sort of terminology thing that I'm going to be talking about a lot as I demonstrate is high points and low points. I'm going to try to go over this quite quickly because it's probably best if I get drawing as soon as possible. Essentially, a high point and a low point are points along the curve where you make a decision to basically find a point and articulate. So this bum, for instance, is just a gradual curve, or this thigh, they're both gradual curves. But at some point along this curve, it turns back on itself, and that's a high point in the curve. So it kind of starts here, kind of works its way along. Probably about here is the point at which it turns back on itself. So that's called a high point. There might be several high points along the curve, but essentially what that means is I could break this into two straight lines, and it will give me a reasonably decent approximation of that curve with straight lines using this high point. If I was to try to put it somewhere else, that would cut off more of what I'm trying to capture. So the more effective you are at finding your high point, so in the case of this bum curve, you would either have to find a single high point which maybe does this, which isn't ideal, or find two high points, so 1, 2, and cuts back that way. So those are basically points along the curve at which the curve starts to angle back dramatically against itself, more so than it has before. This is a clearer example. This curve here, it's quite gradual, but there's a definite cut back there. So as you're trying to create a more kind of structural articulation along curves, you want to find that. Otherwise, if you just kind of try to draw everything as curves, your drawing will end up looking a bit wobbly. Curves are something you want to kind of lay over your articulations at the end, because if you work with straighter lines while you're kind of creating the construction of the figure, you'll find that these straight lines kind of underlay everything and give it a certain architecture, which tends to work well in representational drawing. It gives a kind of solidity to your drawing. Stylistically, you could start to work with a lot of curves, some artists do, but it's a lot trickier to work with curves than it is with straight lines, so I'd recommend when you begin to just kind of focus on straight line articulation as your starting point. And a low point is basically the same thing, but it just occurs where a line is concave rather than convex. So an example of a concave line in this figure would be here. So that's sort of a curve, and that's a low point. Whereas the other side is convex, or all these curves had been convex. This is more of a concave curve here, although that's convex. So that would be a low point, and that would be a high point. It's mainly just a terminology thing, because I might be talking as I'm working about this is a low point, this is a high point. I want you guys to know what that is. It also means that if I'm giving you critiques on your work, and I say that you need to look at this low point or this high point, you know what I'm talking about. As I say, you don't want to find, if you start to find loads of high points and low points on the line, you'll start to add too much detail. So generally for each individual curve, I'll point these out more as we're working, you just want to find one or maybe at most two high points. As I say, this curve here probably required two to actually capture what's going on, because there's almost two curves combined. Generally two would be the maximum you'd need to capture any kind of significant change in a curve. I'll get started drawing now. There's a couple of things I'm going to cover while I'm working, but I don't want it to be too dull in my lesson and talk too much at the beginning. And the other things I'm going to talk about are called, the first one is going to be overlaps, and the other one is going to be looking for a naturalistic rhythm, but both of those things we can start to find as we're working. I've got a sanding block to sharpen my pencil. I'm just going to sharpen that quickly. So I want to keep a fairly sharp pencil. We're going to still be using relatively kind of ghosty, sketchy lines like we were with the gestures as we begin our construct, or our articulation. But as we get nearer the end of this drawing, I'll start to use some more accented, stronger lines, which would remain throughout, kind of towards the end of the drawing. But most of this is going to change, so keeping it reasonably light. I'm just erasing it back for now, so you guys were aware of what the gesture looked like, but as I start to lay my articulations over, I don't get too confused. Because you've got your gesture in, you pretty much captured everything generally going on in the figure. It doesn't matter too much where you decide to start articulating. If you're confident in all your proportions, mostly, then you can pretty much start anywhere. I did this quite quickly, so there might be a few things off, but it's kind of within reasonable realms of accuracy. So even if something seems slightly off from the drawing or the photo, I'd be reasonably happy with this, I think. So yeah, as I say, I would just begin looking for these high points and low points that I was talking about, and then at each high point or low point, I want to look at what the angles are and how they align up. Hopefully most of your alignments should be about right, the major ones from your gesture drawing. So if we try to begin with something reasonably straightforward. Let's say this leg is quite straightforward, so we kind of begin with that, probably the outside contour, and then move to the inside. it's just a case of figuring out what the fewest possible lines that needed to capture what's going on. So a pretty obvious one, I'd say, is my initial drawing just simplified the knee to a pretty kind of right angle kind of corner joint just about here, whereas the knee actually has this sort of little block that, or kind of, wouldn't quite call it a block, kind of a softening of that corner. So I'm trying to avoid getting carried away with adding any lines. So just because you can start to add lines at this point doesn't mean you should add loads. You just want to try to capture whatever's necessary to be pretty close to the actual form. So the top of this knee joint is then just broken down into 1, 2, 3, kind of dipping back as that elbow's pressing down into the leg. So 1, 2, 3, 4 lines. And it was 2 lines, so basically just added an extra couple of lines. The knee then cuts back in, and I want to point out, this is talking about overlaps. The sort of bottom of the patella creates this slight overlap with the calf muscle. So this is sort of all bone, everything that's going on in this area, but then there's a muscle lying here, a muscle below, and then 2 muscles on the lower portion of the leg. And this bone, there's this kind of subtle overlap that occurs here, and an overlap is where one form kind of overlaps the other, as it seems fairly straightforward. So that back muscle kind of gets lost behind a very subtle line that projects forward in front of it. So obviously the human form is this kind of continuous thing. Nothing separate in the human form, but it can overlap itself. So trying to look for some of the other more subtle examples, where say this heel is overlapped by the foot. So the ankle and the heel are close to each other, but because of the nature of the way we're looking at it, it overlaps and disappears behind there. You generally get kind of slight overlap where the hand kind of goes a bit higher up into the arm and the lower portion of the arm drops down here as well. These are very subtle overlaps. Obvious overlaps are where the arm completely cuts off the rest of the body, something like that. But there is a very subtle overlap in the knee. So I won't make it so I'm just exactly copying the contour. I'll carry this little line in a little bit more, and then where the leg starts to cut back again, it'll kind of occur kind of within that overlap. So talking about high points, this is the high point I've chosen for this leg. There's another kind of subtle overlap just here where the foot drops down. And I'm going to add a kind of ever so subtle curve to this line here. So it's virtually straight, but not quite straight. And that pretty much captures everything that we need for that outside of that leg. So I'm not holding a lot of people when they draw, they kind of start and they just kind of work along and they look and then they keep trying to curve back. I'm trying to keep all my separate lines distinct, even if there's only a subtle shift. So I'm not drawing that and carrying on. I'm drawing and stopping and having a look, kind of comparing, working back. Just slowing myself down a little bit in order to keep control of those high points and low points, because they form the overall structure of the drawing. If your high points and low points aren't very clear, everything becomes a bit wobbly, like I was saying before. So if I go down now to this heel, I'd already had blocked in, so I decided from my gesture that was the point at which they overlap, just here. So then the back of the heel might come there. It kind of keeps back of the ankle kind of keeps sloping forward, or lower leg. And then there's quite a high calf muscle, so that was that kind of set of low points and high points we were talking about before. So I've got an ever so slight curve to this line that I'm drawing in. There's a tiny little line there which is worth keeping note of. It's sort of a wrinkle. So something like that's pretty much sufficient. So again, I've got one slight curve, another slight curve, 2, 3, 4 lines, broken down from about 2 I think I had originally, or 3. So I'm not doing a huge amount to change the gesture. I'm just doing what's necessary for the time being. Again, can add this foot in, and there's another kind of overlap that goes on there, so the back toes kind of project out beyond the arch of the foot. I'm still not gonna go into too much detail with the toes. That's something that I would leave a lot later down the line with the drawing. I might look at the bottom kind of shaping, where the big toe is, and something like that, but I won't actually go in and add any specific detail to that lower portion of the foot for the time being. You can, if you like, if you've got a shadow underneath the figure, sometimes it's a bit useful just to kind of drop that in for the time being. It gives you a little bit of direction, a little bit of grounding for the whole thing. So if we go back up to the top of the leg, you can look at how this elbow kind of indents. So it's kind of a curve that way and then an angle back. So if I was to block that in, it might curve here. Got a bit carried away, started doing that top arm. But we want to go back to here. So the top leg has another overlap. So this muscle kind of overlaps the very top part of the leg. So if we go back here, something like that roughly captures what's going on with the top of the leg. Again, I'm using curves, so it's okay to use curves, but you don't want to carry on curves. Some portions, particularly the more bony portions of the figure, will require more straight line articulation. The muscles will sometimes do a bit better with a kind of 2 subtle curves connecting to one another. That's completely fine. If we go back to this bottom leg, we can see the bit of the thigh resting is pretty much just straight across there. And then there's this kind of slightly curved straight line as well. And that pretty much leaves our back leg blocked in. So the next thing we could do is possibly work on this arm, so another fairly straightforward aspect. Kind of get progressively more difficult with it. So we can go to the top. kind of one straight line there. We know this is our elbow. The elbow's got this kind of sharp point at which it turns back on itself. So in this case I'm actually just going through and focusing on the joints to begin with. So as I said, there's this, probably over exaggerated, but there's generally some sort of subtle overlap there where the hand is. Again, I'm not going to add too much detail to the hands for this drawing at this stage. You might revisit this drawing when we're doing some more sort of shadow based stuff, adding detail to a drawing and potentially finishing it. I noticed this in my gesture, but I don't know if I got that calf. I might just have to make that calf slightly bigger when I add it in, but they should just overlap the tip of those fingers. So you see I'm just looking for all these kind of major directional changes in the hand, and that roughly captures what's going on with it. If I go back up to the arm, there's another little jut back here for the wrist. So those 2 points of the wrist being muscular, they're a bit more angular than the curves that occur, or the changes of direction that occur where there are muscles like this, these forearm muscles. So there's this subtle kind of high point about there that shadow will ultimately be. And if I go back to this arm, again there's all these subtle changes of direction. I was talking to a student last week and he was saying that he has trouble exaggerating muscular physiques. So this guy's got a moderately muscular physique, but it's quite rounded. So you want to try to generally you want to understate stuff. It looks a bit better. If you overstate it, it can look a bit like the muscles are poppy or almost cartoony. In a photo it works, kind of you get away with it more because people believe things more with a photo, but when you're working with a drawing, you don't really necessarily, I mean, unless that's the particular style you're working in, you don't want it to look overly cartoony. You want it to look reasonably naturalistic. So again, we're just looking, this guy's bicep kind of drops straight down from his armpit, and then there's this sort of curve back in, something along those lines. And it's reasonably understated and captures what's going on. Back of his arm has a couple of extra little changes of direction, which I think I'll add in as I work. Primarily just there. Otherwise it's kind of one to this high point. And that's about it. So now if I flick my eyes backwards and forwards, I notice that this angle here, the arm as it curves back, is probably a little bit too straight in mine. I maybe exaggerated that straightness slightly. So if I erase that, flick my eyes backwards and forwards and just amend that angle slightly, it works better. And that pretty much does it for that arm. So both those kind of simpler forms are in. We could probably, the next kind of straightforward thing would either be this arm and hand, although the hand might be slightly complex to block in, or probably the back, I would say, is reasonably straightforward. This leg is somewhat complex because of the foreshortening, so it's projecting towards us, so parts of it seem a bit bigger than other aspects of the photograph, and there's quite a few overlaps, so you can see the knee again, as it does here to a certain extent. It overlaps in there, kind of here and here. There are these overlaps as the skeletal portion kind of projects forward where the patella is, and the top, bottom of the femur and the top of the tibia and fibia are all there, so they're projecting towards us, and then there's this kind of complex twist in the foot. So all of that is reasonably complex. The head's not too complex, we can probably block that in, so maybe we'd go and do the head and then do the back. Again, it's reasonably straightforward doing this because I've got a good gesture in place, so it shows how important it is to have a fairly solid gesture before you start to add any detail to your drawing. You'll just find it a lot easier. I mean, I'm just kind of using my eye and fairly confident that the gesture worked, so this subsequent drawing should work as well. So to carry on, we can maybe start here at the bottom. Using alignments, I know that this point here is slightly higher than the elbow, so if the elbow is there, I can kind of imagine a little bit the distance between them. This line angles back. I have already had this marked in, the edge of the thigh and the back of the bum. Can do this in as many curves as you like, but I would probably, as I say, could probably just do it in 2. That's easily sufficient. Again, there's this other, already marked it there, this kind of slight tilt back, so looking at angles, slightly tilted back between these 2 points. Then I won't put all these undulations in these back muscles, that's something we might look at when we start looking at the form. For now I'm just going to keep it fairly straightforward, so I'm just going to block in, I think, a straight line. Again, we know it kind of sits slightly angled back. So angles back to there, and then there's another point here, which if we kind of imagine a little triangle, that muscle I will put in. Then start to add these back muscles in. So I'm looking for this low point here to there. Like that works okay. This might be something you'd revisit later, but it doesn't seem too bad what I've got. Or something I'd revisit later. Something like that. I might just erase and lighten them a bit. So yeah, that pretty much captures the back. I can maybe jump in and block in this stomach as well. He's got these rolls of fat where his stomach's creased over. I might just leave them for the time being and keep it simple. There's something that would make more sense as we add a bit more form. There's another overlap here where his chest kind of overlaps, his pecs overlap his stomach a little bit, kind of coming in there, so we might take a note of that. The reason you want to keep your overlaps in place is they direct your modelling when you actually start to add value to your drawing, so that's something we might do later with this one. But it just makes you think about where forms wrap around and how it makes sense of what's happening. So you'll see this torso is in shadow, and then it's casting a shadow over the lower part of the abdomen and leaves this section of light here. That probably wouldn't happen if it was not overlapped. So the overlaps are useful to pay attention to or bear in mind. But that's pretty much our back in place. if we now move to the head, I'll make some rash judgments about what's going on there. So say that's the forehead, then we've got this little bit of hair that blocks up, and a straight line, another straight line up to this high point for the head. That's maybe the back of it. Something along those lines. It's maybe something we would go back and revisit. Usually with a figure drawing, you're always kind of forced to do a reasonable amount with the head, because that's something that people tend to focus on. For the time being, we're just going to block it in roughly like that. And go back down to the jaw. So this jaw's doing something like that. There's this kind of bearded section. Beard kind of cuts back to there. A lot of the stuff that's going on in the head is going to be addressed later in the drawing. We start to kind of develop forms and look at the specific shapes going on, but that'll roughly do it for now. So the final two things to do are the arm and leg. Everything else works reasonably well as it stands. Just going to think a little bit about those angles, but they seem okay. We can see what's going on. You can start to see definition in these different muscle groups, how they overlap, how they interact, and that's what will help you when you begin to develop into another drawing. It also makes for a reasonably nice drawing in its own right. So if we drop down now to this arm, here we know there's this very strong overlap. It's kind of almost like a crease, I suppose. Comes in there. Kind of just wraps all the way around. Might leave that out of this aspect of the drawing. There's another overlap here. You can just about see a little highlighted muscle as sort of backlit there. Kind of where the trapezoid and the the trapezoid and the bicep meet. Then there's another little angle back there. We can start to just sort of articulate these. Bonier sections. Back up to this muscle. And sort of work these muscles next to one another, so maybe starting back from the top. Palms pressed into the face. Two lines should be sufficient, so angles back this way. And then down here. Then got this thumb. This side of the hand. As I say, we're not going to work too much on hand, so I'm just going to keep this reasonably blocked in. The only thing I might do is just look at where they sort of divide, something like that. That'll probably do for this for the time being. Back of the knuckles are there. Yeah, we're not going to go too much into that because it'll start to become a bit complex. Then we drop down. Straightish. And then bulge back up, something like that. Possibly under-exaggerated it slightly, but it'll do for the time being. And that leaves us the final thing, which is this leg and foot. This more complex leg and foot. You can also block in the box a little bit more, so you can actually see what he's sitting on. So I might begin with the overlaps in the knee that I was talking about. These sort of, the knee kind of sits structurally in a pretty prominent position with what's going on with the leg. So maybe something like that would be sufficient, and then we've got this thigh with a couple of overlaps. It's very foreshortened towards us, and then covered by the knee. The other one's less kind of obviously foreshortened, probably just a kind of gradual curve. Will do for that. Looking at that, I might just, speaking of overlaps making sense, probably want to capture this part of his torso that kind of comes down into the groin area, which is covered. But that's all we needed. Just didn't quite make sense because you didn't get this severe overlap of where the chest was compared to the leg. And then if we drop down to the lower leg, we've got another overlap here, looking at these angles and the high points and low points again. Just keep thinking about those as you're working. For the time being, probably a straight line is sufficient down here. And this portion as well, where it's overlap, maybe you might end up kind of wanting to double back a bit, a little curve there for the calf, and then it kind of slopes down into this twisted foot. Something like that's probably about right. I'm not going to do any line work, this is all value based. Something maybe if we go next week into shadows and we start to kind of analyse how the shadows work with the forms. For the time being we're just looking at the line drawing, so again I'm not going to get complex with the foot, just going to do as much as possible to get it to make sense, which is a hard task with a really weird foot like this. Makes for a nice shape, but it is pretty complex to draw. There's this overlap here, so as often happens, there's this little ankle bone that is jutting out, creating all sorts of weird little shapes. Something like that. Is about sufficient for now. That's definitely something you'd refine, much like the hands. You just wanted to get it to work reasonably right for the time being. But yeah, that pretty much does it for how you'd go about adding these articulations. So they're very early articulations. There are obviously more subtle changes of direction, but for the most part, this captures what's happening in the drawing. And you wouldn't probably want to make your line drawing any more complex until you've added more value to it. So maybe next week we'll do a lesson about adding value, and it'll become quite a good sort of foundational drawing, just to look at all the different aspects of producing a life drawing. Yeah, the only thing about it probably that stands out as a bit weird is this foot, but that's pretty much inevitable when you've got a foot in a strange pose. It'll take a little bit of work figuring it out and getting it to make sense. So your homework's pretty straightforward. It would just be to produce an equivalent drawing, an articulated drawing from one of your gestures. So you can blow up another gesture that you have from a reference, or you can produce something entirely from scratch, whatever you prefer. And just do it this way. So looking at your alignments your angles. High points and low points is the crucial aspect, so you want to find your high points and low points, then figure out how they align and what the angles are. And you'll then look at your overlaps. The final thing I didn't quite talk about, though it should happen naturally if you are looking at things all the time, you're looking at your references, to avoid too much repetition. So there's a sort of natural rhythm to how human forms or natural forms work, trees, branches, the way branches splay out from trees. They're less regular than we tend to make them, so if I was drawing a figure, I'd maybe make it bulge out in exactly the same way on both sides of this arm or both sides of this leg. But generally you'll find the high point and the low point on either side of an arm will be slightly different. You tend to get like the upper arm will be slightly different length from the lower arm. In the fingers are always gradually getting shorter each joint. So there's not that much regularity. There's a kind of regular irregularity, but not in a kind of geometric way. People tend to make things too geometric, whereas nature is more chaotic. And it's that kind of naturalistic rhythm that gives things a beauty. So especially when you're first starting out drawing, try to force yourself to look at what's actually going on rhythmically with what the subject you're looking at. And you'll find really interesting rhythms throughout the lines. And that's what makes drawing really beautiful to look at very often, rather than any kind of regularity makes it a bit more tedious. But that pretty much covers everything. I've got a document as well loaded to the OCAD site and also to the Art Coursework blog. If you have any questions, as always, you can get in touch if you're a member of OCAD Studio. And hopefully you guys will be able to have a go at this exercise and send some work through. I can give you some feedback. And we'll probably go back to this piece, or get back to this piece next week and start looking at laying on a shadow pattern and developing some form. So you guys have a pretty good foundation for how to go about producing your life drawings. But yeah, hopefully that's helpful. And I'll see you guys next week.